Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to talk a little bit more about gender and magical energy, because it turns out I continue to have thoughts on the matter. For anyone who missed my previous video on the matter, I will link it up above. The long and short of it is that I was trained in a coven with really strong gender roles for men and women, or for priestesses and for priests. And part of those really strong gender roles was an expectation that priests and priestesses would move magical power through the circle in different ways, respectively. And in that video, I talked through sort of some of the roots of that, particularly in the occultism of Dion Fortune. Sweetie, what? How did you? The cat is upset that I'm not paying attention to her, and she has knocked down the shower curtain. We'll deal with that later. Um, but so I was trained in a coven that had really strong gender roles and really strong expectations about gendered ways of moving magic. And those expectations largely had roots in Dion Fortune's occultism. Dion Fortune, the originator of that baneful word polarity, as it's used in certain occult spaces these days, but also just a wonderful magician who had a lot of really interesting and insightful things to say, and whose magic was incredibly influential in the modern day. And one of the things that I talked about was, in any coven, I think there are things that you come up in that you don't question how widespread they are. There are certain things that you know are unique to your coven or to your lineage. There are certain things that you know are, if not universal, at least very widespread in the tradition that you practice. And then there are sort of things in between that you don't have a read on. And that highly gendered way of working with magical power is something that I had always assumed was pretty widespread in the tradition. I knew of covens that didn't work that way, but I always thought of those covens as exceptions rather than the rule. And at the end of that video, I kind of just opened it up and said to anyone who was watching and listening, like, hey, help me get a read on this. Help me get a read on how widespread this practice is. Is this something that belongs to my specific initiating coven or my specific lineage, or is this more widespread? Like, what are people's thoughts on this? And I got a lot of really cool and interesting feedback from people kind of all across the spectrum. I got feedback from Gardnerians. I had some really cool conversations with Alexandrians. I talked to people with lineages similar to mine, with lineages very different to mine. And the responses I got were, really interestingly, all across the spectrum. So there were people that I talked to who were like, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about when you say that there's this assumption that priests and priestesses move energy in different ways. That's something we never did in my coven. That's something I've never heard of. Like, absolutely not. No idea where this is coming from. I assume that this is just an idiosyncratic thing in your coven. And then I also talked to people who were like, yes, obviously, that's how we do magic in the Gardnerian tradition. Priests move energy this way, priestesses move energy this way, and that's how you form a circuit, and that's how you build up power, and like, that's what everyone teaches. Um, and everyone was convinced that the way that they were taught was the universal way. And that whoever did things differently was the exception, which is always the case, right? Like, we always assume that our way of doing things is the universal way, and that other people's way of doing things is idiosyncratic. But I really had a strong mix of people from all across the spectrum. And if I had to categorize it, I would say it fell into three main categories. Category one is the kind of coven that I was trained in, which is there are, oh my goodness, I don't know why. I'm on a Mac, and Mac has this stupid feature that's really difficult to convince the Mac to turn off, where if you do like a hand gesture, it will suddenly decide to make an emoticon pop up on the screen. I repeatedly turn it off, and Mac repeatedly, like anytime there's a software update, it tries to turn it back on. Sorry about that if you're seeing that on my screen. Anyways, category 1 is the kind of coven that I was trained in, where there are really strongly defined ways of moving energy for priestesses and priests, and everyone in the circle moves energy in one way or the other. And the dynamic is a little complicated, and some of it touches on stuff that I'm not super comfortable talking about on YouTube, but kind of the fundamental approach to magic in Category 1 covens seems to be that priests give power to the priestesses, and then the priestesses use it. This is most clearly seen in the dynamic of the High Priestess and the High Priest, where he is there sort of in a support capacity. He's giving his logistical, but also his energetic support to the priestess in order to just kind of give her a boost and give her the additional oomph that she needs to do all of the magical work that she's doing in Circle without draining herself, without wearing herself out. And then Category 1 covens sort of generalize that partnered relationship out to everyone in the circle, so that there's this expectation that in the circle, priests are giving power to priestesses, and then priestesses are doing something with that power. We will circle back to this later on because I have more to say about it, but that's Category 1. Category 2 is covens where that sort of dynamic exists between the High Priestess and the High Priest, but not between the rest of the coven members. So I talked to some people who were in covens where they were like, yeah, among the High Priesthood, you have this kind of dynamic where the priest moves, the High Priest rather, moves energy in a certain way, the High Priestess moves energy in a certain way, and again, he's sort of giving her additional power so that she can do the magically taxing things that she's doing in Circle without wearing herself out. He's lending support in whatever way he can. And again, that's not just magical, that's also just like logistical. It's like having a stage director on a play, right? Like you need to have someone who is helping you manage all of the moving parts so that you don't have to do it all yourself. And you need to have someone present in the room who knows what needs to be done and who can do at least some of it without being asked to take some of that burden off of you. And that's part of the role of the High Priest, is just to like make the High Priestesses easier in whatever ways she needs him to do that. But in Category 2 covens, that dynamic, from the people that I've talked to, is really restricted to the High Priestess and the High Priest. And everyone else in the coven does not have sort of a fixed role assigned based on gender or on ritual role of priestess and priest. In those covens, the way that people talked about it, the High Priestess and the High Priest have that partnership, and then everyone else is just sort of generally responsible for raising and contributing magical power in the same way. So you have almost effectively 3 roles. You have the High Priestess, you have the High Priest, and then you have the rest of the coven. And the High Priestess is doing one thing, the High Priest is doing another thing, and then the rest of the coven are, again, if we want to think about like the analogy of a play, they're the chorus, right? They're the ones who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting to kind of help the whole thing go through, but they don't have starring parts, and they're just kind of generally contributing background energy. And then there are Category 3 covens. And again, like these numbers are arbitrary. I'm starting with the one that was most familiar to me and working my way out to the one that was least familiar to me. But I'm not trying to imply a hierarchy or sort of an order of goodness or anything like that, right? Category 3 covens are covens where everyone is moving energy in exactly the same way. There is no distinction, not only between priests and priestesses in general, but even between the High Priestess and the High Priest. So I talked to people from a couple of covens where like there was just no distinction. You raise energy, you move energy, but it was there was no division even in the working partnership of a High Priestess and a High Priest. one person that I talked to, and I hope that you won't mind me sharing this, but just because I think this is a decent expression of the kind of sentiment that I heard from the people who were in Category 3 covens. One person that I talked to said that the idea of having like a gendered partnership be the basis of magical power raising felt like it would be, being back in school again and having to work on a group project with people that you didn't really like. Like the idea that you're sort of chained to someone else as opposed to just being in a coven and everyone is raising energy. Um, those are three very different approaches to the way that energy moves in a magical circle. And I heard very strong opinions from people who were practicing all three ways. And all three of them, the people who shared their opinions were like, no, this is the way it's done in the tradition. What are you talking about with any other ways that people might do it? And I don't know, like if ever there is anything that if ever there's a takeaway from this YouTube channel, I hope it will be that, look, there's just so much more diversity of practice in traditional Wicca than even a lot of traditional Wiccan initiates realize. We're all doing things often the way that we were taught, or if not exactly the way that we were taught, there are always, each coven innovates and does things on its own. But unless you cross-pollinate, unless you're interacting with other covens and other initiates and asking questions about things like this, it doesn't even occur to you the types of things that could be different. And I think this is one of those where a lot of us are accustomed to being in covens that move magical energy a certain way. And unless you spend time around covens that do things differently, it doesn't occur to you that that is a thing that would be different. So I'm glad I made that initial video, and I'm glad that I talked to all of the people that I did. Enormous thanks to everyone who reached out to me and had conversations with me following that video. You're all amazing, and those were all really interesting and productive conversations and gave me a lot to think about with regard to my own practice and with regard to my assumptions about magical energy within Wicca. So I am going to continue to practice the way that the coven I was trained in practiced, partly because it's super fucking effective, partly because it's familiar, but partly because, for reasons that I'm not super comfortable getting into here, there is a way in which that dynamic, that sort of partnered dynamic between the role of the priest and the role of the priestess, really reflects my understanding of the religious mysteries of Wicca that were passed to me and that I pass in turn, right? Yeah, can't go into more detail than that, but what I will do is I will talk a little bit about Gerald Gardner. Gardner doesn't talk a ton about the magical techniques that are used within the witch cult. This is one of the things that he's pretty tight-lipped about. So specific techniques of raising and directing power, he's generally pretty vague about. There are a couple of places where he talks about the role of gender. He talks about male and female intelligences within the circle. And I think it's helpful just to look at the language that he uses and then think about what he's saying, what the assumptions are behind that, and kind of where that's going. So the first quote, these quotes that I'm going to share are both from Witchcraft Today, by the way. And the first quote I have is, let's see. To form this battery of wills, male and female intelligences are necessary in couples. In practice, these are usually husband and wife, but there are younger people who often form attachments which usually end in marriage. There are also, of course, some unattached people, or some whose respective spouses are for some reason or other not members of the cult. Gardner's own wife, Donna, had no interest in Wicca. I have heard fierce purists declare that no married man or woman should belong to or attend any club or society to which their respective partners did not also belong, but such strict views are not part of witchcraft. So that's place number one, where Gardner talks about gendered pairings as kind of a basis of moving magical energy within the circle. Second place that he talks about it, he says, the witch's way of training couples to work together, then a number of couples to work so as to form a sort of battery of human wills, is, I think, a most efficient way of doing things. And that's it. That's the full quote. So we have a couple of sparse references to the idea of couples and then sets of couples forming a battery. Where Gardner talks about the magical power raising methods used in the witch cult, he talks about them as primarily couple-based. These are magical techniques that are designed for use by two people in a partnership. And there is an assumption that those two people should be of different genders. We'll circle back to that in a moment. He then has this idea that you sort of generalize out and build on that partnered dynamic by introducing multiple partnerships within a coven so that you're creating a battery. And I think that that word battery is really useful here because it's suggesting that, you have one person who's doing one thing, they're one pole of the battery. You have one person who's doing another thing, and then you sort of go boop, 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 and it flows from positive to negative to positive to negative to positive to negative around the circle. Gardner talks about male and female intelligences as being necessary in order to work that kind of partnered magic. A lot of people have done experiments with working magic in that way and working magic without the gendered element. So a lot of people have, there have been covens in the past, there are covens today that experiment with moving magic in that partnered way, but without the gendered lines around it. And just saying like, person A is going to do X, person B is going to do Y, we're going to move magic that way, and it doesn't really matter what your gender is, we're just focusing on who's doing what in the circle. And that's legit. And the conclusion that the people who have worked those experiments have come to is that, like, you can work magic effectively using these methods without it being super cis and heterosexual. It is likely that at least part of what Gardner was talking about in talking about this sort of battery of male and female intelligences was something having to do with erotic desire or sexual attraction, especially because he's talking about sort of this idealized vision of married couples being the basis of the working partnerships. So he has this idea that you have a set of married couples, there is something that passes between those married couples, and then you sort of harvest that and build on it by putting a whole bunch of them in a room together and passing that energy around. And when people talk about magical energy, a lot of the time they're talking about a feeling of vitality, a feeling of life force. This relates to a previous video that I did about mesmerism and the influence of mesmerism on Wiccan magic. I will link that somewhere here. But one of the ways that a lot of people experience that feeling of vitality is through eroticism. And I think there is an idea in Gardner's book where he talks about that battery of male and female intelligences between married couples. I think part of what he's saying is that there is a magical tension that is produced between two people who are sexually attracted to each other. Regardless of whether they're doing sex magic, I think he has a sense that there is a connection there that can facilitate magic regardless of the flavor of the magic. So there are people who have taken that idea and kind of run with it in that direction, right? So there are certainly Wiccan initiates who are queer, who say, I want to work magic in partnership with my partner who is of the same gender or the same sex as me, and we're going to draw on that eroticism, we're going to draw on the love or the romantic or erotic connection between us as kind of that that battery that's going to drive the generation of magical energy. That's an approach that I have heard people take. I have heard other people make the claim that the thing that drives the battery between those male and female intelligences is either gender or biological sex. When they say it's biological sex, they're usually making some kind of claim about fertility and the capacity to produce a pregnancy. That is, sweetie, now is not a great time to play fetch. I'm making a video. That is an option that's on the table. I think it's a pretty weak interpretation for a handful of reasons, not least of which is that there are lots of people who are infertile, but who are still welcome in even the most transphobic Wiccan circles. So, like, anyway, that's a dead horse and does not need to be beaten again. But it's an interpretation that's on the table. It's an interpretation that people make. There are people who look at Gardner's idea of this battery, and there are people who say it's all about sexual attraction. There are people who say it's all about gender. There are people who say that it's all about the capacity to conceive a child. I don't really think it's all about any of those things, right? I think that Wicca comes together at a time in the mid-20th century when all the people who were doing it were cis and heterosexual and just kind of made assumptions that anyone practicing this would be the same. So I think that there just wasn't that much thought behind it. But there certainly is this idea in Gardner of partnerships, and assumed to be cross-gender partnerships, being the basis of building up a sort of magical battery, a magical circuit. And if we wanted to use the phrase from Dion Fortune, we could call it a circuit of force. And I find that really interesting. There were covens in the early days that would only initiate you if you came with a partner. There were covens in the early days, and there probably still are covens, that would only accept seekers that arrived in working couples, so that they would always have that perfect balance of priests and priestesses in the circle. They would always have that exact battery of male and female intelligences. That's, to the best of my understanding, that's not a super widespread practice these days, partly because you take the seekers that you have, and if you have someone who's really great, but they, don't have a partner coming with them, it seems like a shame to turn them away, especially because, generally speaking, there are more women than men who are interested in Wiccan initiation. So, I don't know. The Category 1 covens certainly do exist, certainly have existed, right? There is a lot of historical precedent for covens that were like, no, we need to have working partnerships. We need to teach these people in the working partnership to do things this way. We need to teach these people in the working partnership to do things this way. And the purpose of being in a circle together, the way that we raise energy is that you are generating energy in a partnered way between you, priest and priestess, and then every other pair of priestess and priestess in the circle is doing the same thing. And then we link all those circuits up in order to create a larger and more powerful circuit. That's the Category 1 covens. They're around. They have been around. There's precedent for them. There is also precedent for the Category 2 and Category 3 covens. I do not think that any one of these three is more traditional than the others. I think it really depends on the dynamic of the coven that you're working in and the way that raising power works for your coven. These questions about gender and sex and sexuality and, all that business, they're tangled and they're thorny, and there are inevitably some essentialist assumptions that we bump up against. But I am not and have never been in the camp that says we should do away with gender roles in the craft altogether. That is a legitimate stance. It's a stance that's around. It's a stance that there are lots of people who have, and that's great. It's not my stance. It has never been my approach. And yeah, I find a lot of value in that gendered way of moving magical energy. I don't think it's inherently gendered. I think that making it gendered is a choice that we make, where we say, okay, because you are a priest, your job is going to be to move energy this way. And because you are a priestess, your job is going to be to move energy this way. I don't think there is anything essential about being a woman that means you have to move energy that way and not any other way, or vice versa with any other gender. But I think that there is power in it. I think it is a really effective way of doing something like what Gardner describes in Witchcraft Today, where you have the partnerships and then you kind of build out from the partnerships to generate power that way. And then again, for reasons that I'm really not comfortable going into on YouTube, I think it's also reflective of at least my experience of some of the religious mysteries behind Wicca as well. So I don't know, the big takeaway from this video, there are lots of different ways that people approach this. Everyone thinks that their way is the obvious way and the way that everyone does it. And we're all wrong because we're all doing things different ways. And if nothing else, that's really cool. It's really cool that that kind of diversity of practice exists within the tradition. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you sometime soon. Bye.